Hello ladies and gentlemen, today we're back in War Thunder and I want to talk about the Littlejohn Adaptor. Now if you don't know what the Littlejohn Adaptor is, it was basically a little extension of the 40mm barrel. I'm going to be talking in layman's terms here just so it's easier for you if you don't know what it is. At the same time, please research it yourself, there are many nice little articles on it. But the idea of the Littlejohn Adaptor was that you would stick it on the end of the general 2-pounder of the British gun, or the 40mm, which was mounted on machines in the game such as the Tetrarch, such as the Crusader Mark II, the A13s, the Matilda, you get the idea. And the idea of this adapter was that it was designed to be able to fire a special shell. The special shell itself was known as an armor-piercing composite non-rigid design, but after testing and after implementation, the round itself was called the APSV round, which is armor-piercing super velocity. So what this adapter did was, it was smaller than the average barrel. So your general 2-pounder gun is 40mm in diameter. Now what this Littlejohn Adaptor was a 30mm one, which is stuck on the end of the gun. The idea of this, with coupling it with the ammunition that was fired, was that when the ammunition came out of the 40mm, entered the 30mm part, it would kind of crush the front of the round, and obviously the back of the round, making it more streamlined, putting a point on it, so when it hit a target, it would basically act like a saber round or an APCR round. So that's kind of the idea around it. Obviously, you know, sometimes it worked, sometimes it didn't, but the majority of the time it was actually pretty efficient. The also idea around it was that because it was crushed, or because it was pointed, it was more streamlined, moving through the air, so the velocity of it itself was a lot higher than the standard round. So the standard round fired by the 40mm travelled at around 800 meters per second. Once the APSV round was added, with also coupling it with the Littlejohn Adaptor, the round itself actually travelled at around about 1150 meters per second. The easiest way to describe this effect by the adapter and the round itself, it would be pretty much in-game like an APCR round that you would see from other nations. The idea is that the muzzle velocity is increased because the round itself is more streamlined, it's got a point on it so it can penetrate easier, and that's basically it. That's basically what the Littlejohn Adaptor did in real life, and there's nothing else really to it. What was an unfortunate thing about the adapter itself, though, was obviously you have to put it on the gun. So when you were in a battle, in, let's say, a tank-on-tank engagement, it's obviously not easy to get out of the tank and put the adapter on. So what a lot of tank crews figured out was the round itself was a lot better than the standard 2-pounder round that you would get. So even without the adapter on, you could fire the round out of the barrel as normal. So what would happen is the Littlejohn Adaptor would generally just not be used after the tank crews figured out they could just use the round without it. And obviously in the heat of a battle you can't just put it on. So the great thing about the Littlejohn Adaptor is that it gives you access to a round which has higher velocity and therefore higher penetration. Because of this means that at certain tiers in the game, we can actually solve some issues. The Matilda Mark II, in my opinion, is unfortunately balanced by its armor in game and not its gun. What I say about that is basically if you look at the Matilda Mark II just as itself, it has pretty decent armor on it. But the issue is that being at 3.0, it is not able to use that armor. It also has some very obvious weak spots which people can exploit. Even when the Matilda Mark II actually had its model updated, there is still the weak points present on the front of the hull, basically where the driver's position is. And if you hit that sweet spot of 35mm of armor or effective thickness of 50mm, the round itself will go in and kill all of your 4 crew members. Now, the issue with this is the Matilda Mark II sitting at 3.0 tends to get into a lot of battles with the long-barreled 75mm of the Germans, or it gets into the battle of Russian tanks, which end up with the early T-34s, which have more armor penetration than 50, and also, if you're unlucky, stuff like the KV-111, which basically just feels like a better Matilda if you run into it. So, because it's balanced by its armor, and not its gun, that puts its gun in a very awkward situation. It has decent armored penetration, at 79mm, at least at short distances. This means that it is able to deal with Panzer IVs all day. The frontal armor of a Panzer IV F2, the common enemy that you will be fighting, is around 50mm. The flat parts, which you will always shoot because they're so prevalent, is only 50mm, and it doesn't gain any effective thickness really because it's flat, straight onto you. So if you shoot those flat parts, you're completely fine in the Matilda. The issue comes when you start facing other heavy tanks. So if you do face a KV-1L11, which is not something that you often don't do, a lot of people use the KV-111 and also the T-34s, you start running into some issues. So the KV-L11 on the weak spots, which is basically the flat parts of the turret and the flat parts of the frontal plate where the driver and machine gunner sit, the flat parts of the frontal armor is effective thickness of nearly 90mm. And then for the turret, you're looking at around 80mm. Now if we go back to the Matilda gun, the Matilda gun at most can penetrate 79mm, so you have to be very close to the KV-1L11 to actually hurt it from the front with the standard 40mm shell. If we look at the other shells that the Matilda can use, the penetration of the APC-BC shell, which is basically the one which they properly used in World War II, 74mm at maximum. The APT shell, which is the one I generally use, it can pen up to 80mm. So that's still not good enough to penetrate reliably the KV-1L11, which is a tank that you will come up a lot against for Britain. So that is the main issue with the Matilda. It has very good armor, not really at its BR, but its gun is completely useless. Its armor is serviceable at its BR, its gun is not, because you just can't reliably penetrate certain machines. You can't reliably penetrate the upper glacis of a T-34 1940, but that's okay. You can reliably penetrate the turrets, but it's when you start running into stuff like the KV-1L11, or even if you are unlucky enough to run into a Sherman at 3.3, you're going to find it very tough to be able to penetrate anything on the front of a Sherman unless you shoot the lower part of the hull. So the reason why I would add the Littlejohn adapter is to help out stuff like the Matilda. In my opinion, the Matilda and the Churchill Mark I both have this issue, where they have good armor, which can bounce shells, but because Gaijin have designed the game or decided to balance these tanks by their armor instead of their gun, they struggle. They really do. And with the addition of the Littlejohn adapter on machines like this, you'd get access to a new round which would be incredibly high velocity, basically 300 meters per second, more than what you would be used to on these machines. And also, at the same time, you would be able to penetrate stuff. Which, when it comes to the KV1 L11, that would be kind of nice to see, because there have been many times that I've run into KV1 L11s and not been able to do anything. Now, it doesn't generally give you that much more penetration. At 450 meters, what you're looking at from the Littlejohn adapter is that it can pen 88 millimeters. So it may not seem like a big difference to you, but when you're facing a KVL11, that literally is a reliable penetration compared to your other round, which is not. 88 millimeters will get you through that front flat plate. It will also get you through the flat side of the turret, where before you would not be able to penetrate. So therefore, even though it's just a small change of 8 or 9 millimeters of penetration, it makes a massive difference when fighting stuff like that. And it's the same for the Churchill Mark I as well. The A13s, the Tetrarch and the Crusader Mark II, they don't necessarily need the, and also the Valentine Mark I, they don't necessarily need the Littlejohn adapter. But if you're going to add it to the Matilda and the Churchill, you might as well make it universal. You could also add it to the Daimler cars if they start adding them in. I've talked about the Daimler cars before. They were an armoured car used by the British, where they had the 40mm or sometimes just machine guns, and they were pretty nippy, and hopefully they will be the armoured cars, which are chosen by Guardian to put into the game. But anyway, we'll focus on the stuff that's in the game. So, yeah, you could add it to all of these machines. It would make them just slightly better, and it would make the Matilda and the Churchill Mark I viable options. The Churchill Mark I, because of its decent armor, its 3.3, is already a viable option. But one of my tanks, which I really enjoy from a historical sense, the Matilda, is in an absolute horrible place because of the gun that it's been given. So therefore, even just adding the Littlejohn adapter just to that machine, it would be a massive load that the Matilda could take off of its back. Just with an extra 8mm or 9mm of penetration, the Matilda itself could become an actual viable machine. You may actually see them in matches, instead of people going for the Cromwells and people going for the Valentines. So it would be nice just for that fact. If you wanted to do a half measure, instead of adding the Littlejohn adapter, what you could just do is add in the shell, the APSV shell. As we already know, it was better than the standard AP shell that the British used, and could be fired without the Littlejohn adapter attached. And once again, it would be historical. It would be something that was used in combat without the Littlejohn adapter. So what got me thinking about this idea? Well, if we look at a few choice planes in the game, which we've seen added for maybe the last 2 years or so, the Ki-43 is a really interesting set of machines, and I want to focus on the Ki-43-1, the Hayabusa. It sits at a BR of 1.7, but when you actually start off with this machine, you only have two 7.7mm. Now, if you look at the modification tree, you will see there is an Otsu mod and a high mod. Now, the Otsu mod gives you a 12.7, so you have a 7.7 and a 12.7. If you unlock the high mod and use it, you get two 12.7mm machine guns. So we already have in game this idea that you can upgrade your guns using the same vehicle. If you want another example of this, we can go to the Russian tree on an earlier example of this happening. The Yak 9UT starts off with a 23mm and two 20mm in the nose. What you can do with upgrades, if you look at the Tier 3 and Tier 4 modifications, at Tier 3 you're able to gain access to the 37mm N37, which replaces the 23mm, Or if you want to go even bigger, you can get access to the NS45, which once again replaces the 23mm, sorry. So we have precedent in the game for gun additions or gun changes. If you want an example of an addition, well, all you have to do is look at the British, not the British tree, sorry, the German tree. If you look at a lot of the BF-109s and some of the Focke-Wulfs, they have the idea that one of the secondary weapons you can have is add-on cannons. The BF-109 G2 Trop, it's the R6 modification. It gives you 2 extra 20mm on top of your 20mm in the nose, so you end up with 3 20mm and 2 7.92mm. So that would be a case of an add-on amount of guns. So we have precedent for add-on guns or additional guns, and we also have precedent for changing the gun itself. Now this hasn't been applied to tanks yet, but I think this could be a first nice step in the direction of some positivity of being able to change the guns. I'm not talking about anything drastic like World of Tanks, where in World of Tanks you get a chassis and then you can kind of just mount different guns on top of it. I like the idea that we have many different tanks with the same chassis but different guns. It means that you can balance them easier. But I still think that a modification which has the Littlejohn adapter, it could be in tier 4 if you wanted, just put the modification in tier 4 or tier 3 and I would be completely fine with that. Because you're not fundamentally changing the gun which is on the machine, you are just literally adding to it. It would be the same as if you had a 76mm, let's say, on a Sherman, and you decided to put a muzzle flash on the end of it. So maybe you could have an upgrade for that. For the Matilda and the Churchill Mark I, it is necessary that they get something on their side, which means that they're able to penetrate some of these larger tanks. Because it's been very clear from the way that Gaijin have balanced the game, that the idea is that armor is secondary to weaponry. And with tanks like the Matilda and Churchill, this case is just not the fact. Their armor is primary, and their gun is secondary. So therefore, we need a way to make the gun viable, and we need a way to make the tanks be seen in game. Because right now you never see them. They are not even considered for play. And that is either down to the BR, which is down to their armor, and therefore the gun is not even taken into account, or it's down to people don't like playing them. Now generally, it's not really a case of people not liking a tank. In a community, if you have a general consensus that a tank isn't loved or a tank isn't liked, that can only go so far. You would still see some of them in game, there would still be some people who would enjoy them. But at this moment in time, I haven't seen a Matilda in a battle for maybe a year, apart from if I'm driving it. I've seen a few more Churchill Mark 1s, but the Matilda itself is just dead to rights, because of the fact that its gun is so useless, and it has that massive weak spot on the front of it. So maybe with the addition of smoke grenades, maybe it sees a bit more play, but I haven't seen it, so therefore something else has to be changed. And to keep it historically accurate, to keep it, in keeping with the existing rules of War Thunder in the form of additional weapons and changes to weapons, I think the Littlejohn Adaptor could be the thing that makes the Matilda rise from the ashes. But I tell you what, you tell me what you think. Because it does actually matter to me what you think. I've had a lot of interesting conversations on many topics on the channel, and I understand that I don't always fall on the side of the community at large. Do you think if something like this would be added, there would be a lot of people clamoring for other modifications for guns, and therefore it would kind of get out of hand? Or do you think it's worth it just for a one-off thing to try and help out a tank which never sees play, and unfortunately is in the doldrums right now. But anyway, I hope you all have a wonderful day, and I'll see you next time.